So welcome everyone once more to the webinar on keeping students engaged in a transition to online learning. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our presenter, Dr. Betty Jo Boucher, who is an Associate Professor and Associate Dean at the College of Professional Studies and Advancement at National Louis University. The floor is all yours, Betty Jo.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, and welcome everyone to this pop-up webinar focused on keeping students engaged in an online environment. And for many of you, or most of you, or all of you on the webinar today, I suspect 100% of your students will be in an online environment for at least the next few weeks. So we are hopeful that what we talk about today will be useful to you and to your faculty as we continue to navigate these strange circumstances we find ourselves working under. The theme that we'll sort of rally around this afternoon about is be human, be present, and be adaptable. So you'll see that coming up as a theme. Certainly we want to exhibit these things in our teaching and in the way that we're working with faculty, staff, and students. And I would really recommend that we use this as our mantra just in all of our interactions, certainly in these times and frankly, all around. So let's go ahead and take a look at an agenda for today. We're going to talk about being human, being present, being adaptable, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. I wanted to sort of exhibit my humanity, my ability to be present, and my adaptiveness, and show you my 8th grade picture from Clarigale Middle School in Idaho Falls, Indiana. You can see that I have adapted a little bit over the years. I show you this for a few reasons. One is it's a nice kind of icebreaker, and it's always fun to look at old school pictures. But I do think it's so important to be vulnerable in our teaching and vulnerable in our relationships and just be the humans that we truly are. So here I am in my glory, my Beat It shirt that I wore every single day of 8th grade, every single day. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump right in. So I do want to set the stage just a little bit to kind of, orient us around the fact that online teaching and learning are new skill sets for many of our faculty, for many of us. And frankly, it's something that gets developed over time, just like teaching and learning in general. It's important to me and hopefully to you as well to really give ourselves grace and some time to develop these skills with the knowledge that some of us might find ourselves in a position where we're teaching remotely and online in a couple of hours to our students. Just know that, all of us in online ed are really rooting for you and standing behind you, and also continuing to remind everyone that will listen that it may not be perfect this first time out of the gate. This is a new thing that you might be doing, and we want to make sure that you're being kind to yourself and also sharing that, with your students in a way that makes sense for them to contextualize as well. And you'll notice this theme sort of throughout the presentation as well is when we talk about student engagement in an online environment, we're also really talking about faculty engagement. In fact, we will find that student engagement is very highly correlated to faculty engagement. So the more the faculty are leaning into their online course, the more students lean in. Very much like a face-to-face course, right? Lively, engaging, fun faculty that are in front of their students in a face-to-face environment will have better attendance rates and happier students and better performance. The same is absolutely true in an online course. The more your faculty lean into online, the more your students will as well. It is nearly a one-to-one. I should note too, though, that engagement can be thought of a little bit differently in online in terms of how we think about synchronous online versus asynchronous online. If you're not familiar with these two terms, it just bears, sort of contextualizing very quickly, and that is Synchronous online is essentially what we're doing right now. I could be your faculty member and you could be my students, and this could be the way that we're sort of satisfying the instructional time that would normally be spent in the classroom. So that's most often what we associate synchronous online with, are these kinds of sessions that we're doing today. Whereas asynchronous instructional strategies are more about potentially what's happening in the learning management system, what might be done in an ed tech tool. The trick there is that students and faculty are engaging with these activities and these assessments at different times, that there isn't this, sort of we all get together and do this particular thing at the same time. So those are sort of the differentiators in terms of how we will often see online be implemented. It's also important to note that we will often see them implemented in the same class. In fact, we will also see that sometimes we have better outcomes in online courses that do have synchronous and asynchronous activities, sort of a combination of both, if you will. But whatever the exact modality that is being implemented in an online course, and frankly in a face-to-face course as well, I would argue that being human, being present, and being adaptable are the three big skills, the three big focal points that we need to be thinking about as we approach this new term for many of us that we're approaching, as well as some that are finishing the last few weeks of their semester. So let's start with the be human part. I'm hopeful that many of you were able to attend the last webinar with my colleagues, Karen Costa and Cleo Mahoney, around synchronous sessions, and they talked about Maslow before Bloom's. I am talking about Maslow before Bloom's, and I hope that you do as well. So we, as we look at this shift, this pivot that we're all trying to make, it is so important to focus on the bottom of the Maslow hierarchy to say, what are the needs of my students today and how do I satisfy them? I'm gonna get to all of the fantastic instructional strategies in online eventually. It might just not be on this first round. We have to kind of get through what the students are going through right now, what I am going through right now, before we get to some of the sort of higher order taxonomies and different evidence-based instructional practices. So, provide yourself, the opportunity to focus on the needs that are in front of you around your humanity and around the humanity of your students. I will also say another theme in this presentation is sort of rather simple, and that is, when faculty come to me and they say, how am I going to do this in an online environment, which, by the way, I've heard just a few times over the last couple of weeks, my answer back is, well, what would you do in the face-to-face classroom? Let's just do that. So the interesting thing that I find when we kind of work through these questions and answers around how do I do something that I would normally do it in the face-to-face classroom in an online environment is it is much the same. We're really just changing the technology around that. So, in this particular slide, when we're talking about, sort of the humanity around teaching, we're talking about creating relationships. And so the core question is, what would you do in your face-to-face course to create relationships with your students? And let's just do that, right? You can simulate the human experience of a face-to-face interaction through technology. In fact, there's ample evidence to support that the medium that we're working in right now, this web conferencing with camera and audio, is just as rich a communication medium as a face-to-face meeting. Now, not everyone is going to lean into that research. I think that's reality, but I will tell you that having worked, in a semi-remote position for several years, I find that it is just as easy to build strong, lasting relationships over Zoom, over the phone, as I can when I do those things in person. So just to know that even those students are coming into this online environment, and frankly, our online students in general also crave that those other pieces of communication. So do call your students, do text them, do use video in your online classroom, and personalize your emails to them. One tool that I have been promoting recently that I have picked up from my son's K through 12 teachers who are also pivoting to e-learning in these past weeks is the Remind application, the Remind app. You know, it's a really nice application that your students can load on their phones. They can subscribe to your classroom, and you can text them reminders. You can text them check-ins. How are you doing? Don't forget, we have a synchronous session tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to seeing you. So remember that your online classroom is not the only way that you have to communicate to your students. And we also find that when we go outside of that one medium, that learning management system, our students are really grateful for that. I primarily teach online, and when I call my online students, they're often sort of surprised, but also really heartened to hear from me. So do take the time, you know, to contact your students outside of what you're doing in the learning management system. And it's so important to use videos. And one thing I will say about videos too that I have found is that the more casual and the more human a video is that you put into your course, the more the students appreciate it. Everyone is going through the same things. Everyone is trying to balance their life. Everyone wakes up in the morning without makeup. It's okay. Just record yourself and say, here's what's happening today. Here's what was on my mind. Here's what we have coming up. And thank you for listening. I mean, it can be really that simple. Only a couple of minutes of of recording yourself doing that can make a big difference to sort of injecting some humanness into your online class. And the other things I have here on this slide, you know, just sort of simple redirects, if you will. So, you know, a lot of times we talk about the age-old discussion question in online courses. You know, I will say that online discussions have maybe gotten a bad reputation in some circles of online ed. But here's the thing. If you treat an online discussion like a bi-directional dialogue that you would normally have in class, it can be that simple. You can do that. You can encourage your students to participate in online discussion forums by participating in them yourself. You know, facilitate that dialogue, encourage students to talk to each other, share your experiences, further their inquiry on a subject. You know, maybe they they hit it out of the ballpark on their first reply. Well, there is always more learning to do. Push them some new articles, push them to new videos, continue that dialogue throughout the week. This is your opportunity to facilitate a week-long conversation. After you model those behaviors, your students will quickly condition themselves to the need to participate in an online discussion. And when you look at your grading of your assignments, very similar adaptation. View your grading feedback as your one-on-one session with that student. How do I help this student get to the next level? How do I provide enough feedback so that they know how to improve? How do I provide feedback in a timely manner? And how do I provide the right amount? And, you know, I'm not sure we'll get to the bottom of that today. Sometimes too much feedback is too much. You know, we have to pick our battles here. But just know that personalized feedback, even just using a student's name in the feedback, will change how they receive it. If they understand that they are receiving individualized feedback, especially curated for them and the assessment that you're grading, I would argue that they will read that and start incorporating those feedback going forward. I will also say there are certainly times when students don't read our feedback, and there are simple techniques that you can use to get them to engage in it. And that is sending them a quick note, personalized email saying, hey, Betty Jo, I noticed when you turned in your week 2 paper, it had a couple of the things that I was trying to address with you in your week 1 paper. I wonder if you had reviewed my feedback, and maybe we can hop on a Zoom for a few minutes and I could show you how you can improve your week 2 paper before, before you get to week 3. Right. And so you can continue to encourage students to lean into these things that you are spending time on. And then lastly, one thing that I would recommend when we're just looking at sort of infusing our online classroom with our humanity is having some optional non-graded hangouts with your students. A bit of a colloquial term here, but I will say that, just offering even just virtual office hours or saying, hey, Friday at 3 o'clock, I'm gonna hop on Zoom. If anyone wants to hang out with me for a little bit, we don't even have to talk about this course. We can just talk about other things that are going on. I will be there. I hope to see you too. This is a nice opportunity for you to provide the opportunity for this sort of co-curricular conversation, but also just express that you are in this with them, right? And you are willing to spend that 30 minutes on something that doesn't even relate to your course. And this is a great way for students to develop peer-to-peer relationships as well, right? A lot of times when students are in fully online environments, sometimes they forget how to establish relationships with their peers. And so this is a great way for them to not only establish a relationship, but certainly, leverage and continue to build a relationship that they may have already had built up in that face-to-face classroom as well. So let's turn our attention to being present. If you recall, when I sort of kicked this off, it is really a lot of what we talk about with respect to student engagement has a lot to do with faculty engagement. And the way we sometimes talk about that is presence. The sort of variety and frequency of your presence in the online classroom sets a precedent for your students. And so in the same way that you would show up to class for your face-to-face courses, show up to your online course. If you are having a synchronous session, be on time. If it's purely asynchronous or you have a combination with asynchronous activities, log into your class every day, even if just for a few minutes, to answer an FAQ or participate in a water cooler conversation, facilitate that discussion we were talking about, keeping that EdTech tool moving. Maybe you have a voice thread in there that you need to continue to facilitate. And importantly, engage in meaningful dialogue. And so, it is really important to say, not only should you pop in and answer a few things and kind of poke around in your online class every day, but really take this as your opportunity to continue to move students through their learning. This is your opportunity to teach when you log in. So when you're facilitating those discussions, when you're working with VoiceThread, when you're sort of looking at journaling activities, all of these different kinds of things that you can do in an online class, be sure that you are always pointed towards the learning, moving students through their learning, much like you would in your face-to-face course. And partly too, and just as important, is providing that direction. One thing that I will say too, not to sort of hammer too hard on online discussions, sometimes online discussions can get a little off track. And so even more important for you to take a look daily and kind of move students through a direction into the learning, into further inquiry, moving students towards either the learning outcomes or to other peers or to other content or content within your course. You are there as the referee in that online course. And I've mentioned a couple of these different things in my language just now, but to really provide some clarity, what you're trying to do when you're logging in every day is kind of balance what you do around evidence-based instructional practice. I have some graphics here up on the slide of great frameworks that really inform how we can do that in an online environment. We have the community of inquiry up in the upper right-hand corner. that talks about social, cognitive, and teaching presences. We have Quality Matters, who has some very clear standards, and Oscar, who both have some very clear standards around, the learner interaction in your courses that are being, sort of built and utilized for teaching. But the net of it is this: even if you don't have time to read through all of these research, all of these evidence-based strategies, I will say this: if you're going in every day and moving students through their learning in a meaningful way, connecting them to each other, encouraging the use of the course materials, you're hitting all the right things. That is all that it is. And and I think it can be that simple, right? And so I want to make sure that I pay homage to the evidence-based practices that we really rely on up here on the screen. But just know, if you are doing these three things: logging in, providing meaningful dialogue, and providing direction, you are really getting the high points, especially in the short term as you're learning this new skill. I will also say a couple of other kind of housekeeping items around presence that I have found really helpful, or that I would encourage you to do, is to keep a student log. My guess is this may sound old school to some of you, but I take notes on what's happening in my online courses with my students as I'm teaching. So I just have a little grid of my student names and I have it by week, and I write a couple of notes down about them. I write more notes during week 1 when they're doing the introductions. So I remember, did they mention they have, kids? Where do they work? What are their goals? What program are they in? When they're providing these introductions, I take all of those notes, and then I go back when I'm logging in every day and I'm engaging in meaningful dialogue and providing direction. I use my student log to thread what I understand about them, and or to thread what they're working on through those dialogues and those directions. So this is a nice way to continue to honor who your students are and continue to remind them that you're paying attention, that you are focused on them individually. So again, just a sheet of paper with some jotted down notes that likely no one else could read but me, but has really been a valuable way for me to kind of keep track and gather my thoughts about what's going on with one class in one way. And then lastly, I think this is so important, and I would say this sort of in all areas of life, but certainly when we're teaching, is bring your whole self to your online class, just like you would in a face-to-face setting. We are all humans. We are all doing the very best we can. I think it is so important to think about vulnerability in teaching and how that changes the relationship towards mutually respectful dialogue and relationships. Just bring yourself into that class, be who you are. And when you do that, you encourage your students to do the same. And remember when we talked about how you develop those relationships, it comes really naturally when you're being yourself and your students are being themselves as well. I think this is so important in teaching. So, and again, not just in teaching, let's bring our whole selves to all that we're doing. And the sort of third focus is be adaptable. So there's a lot of stuff here. There are 2 slides on being adaptable. It's so important. And so again, the prompting question: what would you do in your face-to-face class to evaluate learning? Let's do that in the online environment. So here are just a couple of things that I would recommend that you do if you don't already, and then also a few things to take a look at when you're sort of have your entire course in an online environment. First thing I think is really important, especially if you're doing synchronous sessions, and also important if it's asynchronous, is creating some baseline knowledge events, some classroom assessment techniques that help you understand where your students are right now in their understanding of your topic, so that you can pivot to the needs of that student group. One of the things that we sort of talk about in online education is that sometimes the course is sort of set up in advance, and it kind of makes assumptions about where the students are in their learning, kind of based on the program outline, if you will. And that's an okay place to start. I don't get mad about that, but because the teaching part is where we can kind of adapt and customize what we're delivering to students based on what they understand. And sometimes it's just as easy as sort of asking them what they already know about the subject. It can really be that easy. And then you can kind of curate either your live session or maybe your recorded video that you put into the learning management system, and maybe even change the discussion question to sort of make sure that you're getting at, if there are any gaps in their learning. And boy, if they already understand the subject, let's get them to the next level of inquiry on that subject as well. There are a few data that I would really encourage you to look at while you're conducting your class fully online. The interesting thing about online education is the transparency of it. There are a lot of data being generated behind the scenes in your learning management system, not only about what your students are doing, but also, frankly, about what you are doing. All of those things are logged, and this big digital footprint is being generated over time in that online class. And so here are 3 pieces of data that I would encourage you to look at the very least weekly, perhaps more often if you have a shorter class as well. So the first one, no surprise, let's look at grade performance every week on each of your assessments. The learning management systems are pretty sophisticated at this point and have some really nice reporting features built into them. If you haven't had the time to investigate that, I would recommend that you take a look. You could also just glance at the grade book if that is more familiar to you. But again, this is a way for you to think about what is it that students maybe didn't quite get this week that I need to address in the beginning of next week, so that we're continuing to scaffold our students through to the final learning outcomes associated with that course. So that's the first piece of data, the grade performance. The second one is attendance, and we tend to think about attendance slightly differently when we're talking about synchronous versus asynchronous. So it's pretty simple. Attendance at a synchronous session is pretty easy for you to get at. You can scroll through the tiles at the top of the screen and see who is actually there. You could have them put their names in the chat. There are different kinds of ways you could get at that. Asynchronous attendance is sort of when they're logging in. How often are they logging in? How long are they staying when they are there? And what are they doing when they are there? Which is related to the third point. So when you are finding students that haven't logged in for 72 hours, for us at National Louis University, that is a big red flag. In fact, a lot of things happen in our student advising department when we are flagged with an online student who hasn't logged in for 72 hours. That's kind of our golden hour. And it sort of prompts, some communication protocols and some activities to get the students back into their online course. So do look at the login report. If you're noticing that you have students who are approaching that third day, give them a call, send them an email, push something out to remind, hey, is everything okay with you? How are you doing, right? Just express your concern. You don't necessarily have to say, I noticed you weren't in class. You can say, I don't think I've seen you in class since Monday, and as we're approaching Wednesday, I just want to make sure you have everything that you need. Is there anything I can do to help you? And so we don't want to shame students into attendance. We want to encourage them into attendance. But that 72-hour mark is really important. As is the content access. So remember, I said it's just as important that they're in there, but it's also important what they're doing when they are there. And so most of the learning management, in fact, I think all of the learning management systems are able to show you a visualization of the content that's being accessed by student. And so let's say you are in week 3 of a 6-week course, and you notice that one of your students has only accessed 30% of the course materials. Well, that might be a challenge for them being successful in that course. And you could reach out to that student and say, I just want to remind you, I've spent all this time curating these course materials for you. I think they're going to really help you be successful this week. Are you having trouble finding them? Is there anything that I can do to help? But really encourage your students to access your course materials that way. Kind of look at, how that course access is also relating to their grade performance. We will often find that students who are not attending as frequently are not doing as well from a grade performance perspective, and are also not accessing the content as often as their peers, right? So these things are pretty related, which is why there's a bullet here that asks you to triangulate these data. So think about what's on your student log, what you know about this student, and how did they do on their last couple of assessments? Are they logging in frequently? And are they accessing the content? Are they attending their synchronous sessions, right? If you were to triangulate all these data, you would build a story about each of those students that would help you understand how to help them, right? So essentially what you're doing, and I again argue that you would do this once a week, is you're using these data to then plan actions, individual actions with those students. And typically these will take the form of communicating to your students, going back to that phone, email, text, remind. Certainly if you have student services available to you at your institution, use your EABs and your starfishes. Make sure that you are engaging people, as quickly as possible. But again, it's so important for you to be also reaching out to that student, to express your care, to express your curiosity, and to offer your support. Sometimes it's just one email where you say, is everything okay? That really changes a student for the better and really prompts them to jump back into your course. And so the last things about being adaptable, you've heard me say here that, I would argue that looking at these data, every week is really important. I would say too that you're looking at your student data every week and you're really engaging in reflective practice around that and thinking through, how did this week go? How do I feel? How do they seem to be feeling, the students? Were there things here that I tried that just didn't work out? Were there things that I tried that were absolutely awesome? What are the things that I need to be providing to remediate or to scaffold more for my students for next week? And frankly, it's kind of interesting to be in this big pivot because it does afford us some opportunity to experiment as well, right? This might be kind of a forgiving time to try new things because as long as you're failing forward and you're communicating openly with your students, I think they will appreciate that you're trying a few new things. And you can really engage them in that process as well. And then last thing I would recommend around adaptability, and I said it earlier about baseline knowledge, is to really utilize CATs, these classroom assessment techniques that get you quick information about how students are doing and how they're moving towards their learning. Some quick examples are, doing a muddiest point. What are you still confused about this week? And it can be a quick poll, a quick survey. You can ask them on a synchronous session. You could do exit slips online. It's super easy to say, what was the one thing that you feel really confident in now? What were you excited about? What are you still confused about? 1 to 3 questions is really all, you sort of need to then say, oh, I need to kind of do something about this, right? Where there's curiosity or confusion, I need to scaffold and remediate. Where there is really high level of learning, maybe I need to think about that for next week. Maybe their baseline knowledge is a little bit more broad than I thought it was, and I want to scaffold down in one area so that I scaffold up in another. The idea around this adaptability is really thinking through your teaching, you know, pushing past maybe some anxieties about teaching online and just treating this like you would normally treat your instruction and your teaching, where you're sitting in reflection and you're planning next week and you're using all the data that the learning management system affords us, you know, using all of what you know about your students and then planning new strategies for the next week. And so here's a couple of other things to consider. Certainly, let's be amazing together. But just 4 things I would kind of leave you with here in terms of things to keep on, you know, on mind are, you know, your students are feeling the same way you are right now. You know, we are all sort of in this very uncertain space right now. And it's so important to not only give yourself grace and those around you, but to afford grace to your students. This is the time to be accommodating, to be flexible and adaptable, and express our care for our students. You know, and it's okay to incorporate what's going on into your course. And I will say, if you don't make the space for current events to show up in your teaching, it's probably going to show up anyway. So, you know, I would be hard pressed to find any discipline that there would be no way for you to pull in current events to really contextualize the learning. So plan a lesson or plan for time just for your students to talk about this. So even if it's not around a lesson, just plan the time, the 10, 15 minutes it's going to take on a synchronous session, for example, to let students vent a little bit, to talk about what's going on, then shift into your lesson. Or plan a lesson where the coronavirus, the COVID-19 situation is part of your lesson so that students get to process what's going on, but also through your learning outcomes. And again, I would be hard pressed to find a discipline where we could not do that. It will take some planning, however. I mentioned this at the very beginning. I just want to keep saying it too, and that is just know that the first time you try some of these new skills that you're learning in this big pivot, it may not work out. And you just have to use a little humor and a little humility and say, gosh, that didn't work. And it's okay. You know, you will get to the next synchronous session. You will get to the next week, you know, and really partner with your students in this journey. Involve them in that conversation. You know, it's okay for students to know that you are trying something new. And it's okay for them to sort of see you, you know, not succeed in the way that you are, you know, sort of accustomed to when you're face-to-face teaching because you're trying this new thing. So partner with them, ask them how they want to learn. What are their ideas as well? You know, consider that, you know, some of our students are adults. A lot of our students are adults, and they have a lot of thoughts and feelings about their instruction, their class, and what's going on in the world right now. And, you know, do your best to find ways to pull all of these thoughts and insights and honor the experiences and the thoughts of your students, because as you do that, your students lean into your course, they lean into you. And that is all that this is about. When you lean into your students in an online class, they lean into you as well, just the same as this would happen in a face-to-face course. So with that, let us do a classroom assessment technique. Let's do a muddiest point. If you go to slido.com and you put in this code U097, tell me what your muddiest point is from this presentation today, and then we will sort of shift into the Q&A portion of our webinar. I'll go ahead and put mine in even. Oh, I wonder why they're not showing up on the screen, darn it. Remember that thing where I said sometimes it doesn't work the way you want it to? I feel like we might be having one of those moments. Let's try it one more time, see if I can get it to come up. Well, I can see them on my phone, and so so what I will do is pivot briefly here. I will move on from the slide, but you can continue to contribute to the Slido. I can see them all on my phone. And I will, Caitlin, if it's okay, should we transition to Q&A here then?
Yeah, I think that would be great. We have a lot of great questions in the Q&A. And I see some people have offered some responses in the chat, but yes, we have a whole lot open for you, Betty Jo.
Excellent. Well, you know, what I'll do, I will just, I will leave this screen here for just a couple of minutes. It has my contact information here, you know, happy to do email, and certainly, you know, we can engage in some fun Twitter conversations, which by the way, are absolutely awesome about online right now. But I will stop sharing my screen so I can see myself on the screen and you can see me as well while we shift into Q&A. So with that, let me jump in here. What are some tips for being human? I'll just start at the very top. Is that the right thing to do, Caitlin?
Yeah, so it'll be in order of upvotes. So yep, that one has the most votes right now.
Awesome. Okay. So what are some tips for being human with students who don't have a computer or Wi-Fi access at home? Yes, and are using their phones. Yes. So, you know, I think, you know, interestingly, the good news with smartphones is that most of our learning management systems obviously, you know, have apps associated with them. So they should be able to participate certainly in the asynchronous, and Zoom has a great app if you're using that for your synchronous. But I think the same things hold true here, is that, you know, if you're also, you know, embedding video and using phone, text, and email to communicate with them. I think everything we talked about today around being human, you know, students will still be able to see that on their phone. It'll just be a lot smaller. And maybe with students who are going to be purely, you know, working on their courses over the phone in the spring, maybe you set up some one-on-ones with them and, you know, spend maybe even just 15 minutes with them over Zoom once a week. To just make sure that they're able to kind of, you know, navigate your course and that they're picking up, you know, what they need from that. You know, just because that screen is so small too, and not all of our, you know, content shows up correctly. And the next one is, oh, I'm not familiar with Maslow. Yes, yes, yes. So Abraham Maslow is a famous psychologist who developed the hierarchy of needs. It's a pyramid. At the very top is self-actualization. At the very bottom are sort of basic human needs around food, shelter, and safety. And many of us would argue that our students, and frankly some of us, are kind of at the bottom of the pyramid these days. Maslow said that you really can't move up the pyramid towards self-actualization until you meet the needs right below it. And so a lot of us are thinking about, we're really in the bottom of the Maslow pyramid right now, trying to get our basic needs met. And because of that, it's kind of hard to think at these big higher order spaces. So how many students do you typically teach at a time online? So yes, this is an interesting dialogue in online ed around these big sections. And so you know, this is certainly an institutional, you know, institutionally specific kind of question around, you know, what are your caps in online courses. I think one of the things I would recommend in very large sections is actually using video and summary discussions in a way where you're not having to actually go in and facilitate every single discussion, for example, but that you're sort of ending the week with your big themes. You know, these are the themes I saw. You're inserting a video saying, oh, and by the way, Matt also said this, and I thought that was great. And you can really do this in sort of an aggregate fashion. You can also kind of do that with your feedback in some ways too. There may be some common things that you see across several papers, and maybe you put that in an announcement, and part of the way you shortcut your grading feedback is, you know, hey, Caitlin, this was, you know, a great paper. Here are some of the things that I would really like to see you work on. Oh, and, you know, if you could just look at, you know, the feedback areas 2 and 3 in my big announcement this week, those are a couple of things for you as well. So just a couple of small tips there, you know, but this is a big dialogue, and there's quite a lot. If you Google online teaching in large sections, you will find a lot of resources as well. Do you provide students your cell phone? Yes, yes, yes. So that this is highly stylistic in nature. I will tell you that I do supply my students my cell phone number. I have been doing that since 2012. There was a period of time where I tried to use Google Phone, and it just felt like more work for me than was necessary. And you know, I tell my students when I will be available, and frankly, I have never had students abuse this. And I teach at all levels. I teach at the undergrad level all the way through the doc level. And I have only very occasionally had students call me outside of, you know, regular hours. And of course, I put my phone on silent when I'm sleeping. But interestingly, when you provide your cell phone and you tell them it's your cell phone, you know, there's something about that that they kind of take seriously. Like, wow, this professor is giving me her cell phone. I better be careful with it. So, you know, this again, completely up to each individual, but if you're not going to provide your cell phone number, certainly a Google number, you know, is a good proxy, as long as there is a phone number, right? That's really important. So when you say turn into the course every day, assume you mean in different matters, you're really expecting students to log in every day. Yeah. Well, yeah, so it may not always be feasible for everyone to log in every day. Interestingly, though, I will say that there is always something going on in an online class. And it doesn't have to be that you're spending 2 hours. It could mean that, so in traditional online ed, if you will, quote unquote, you will often sort of see, you know, a Wednesday, Friday, Sunday kind of, you know, due dates, if you will. And so there might not be a lot going on in an online class on Tuesdays if the original post isn't due until Wednesdays. But you can just pop in there to see if there is something, maybe in your FAQ, you know, maybe students have said, oh, I wasn't able to find this in chapter 3, or the book isn't working, or what have you. But I actually do think it is reasonable and possible for you to log in every day and to ask your students to log in frequently. So are there resources we can share with students about transitioning? Gosh, yes, Christine. So, you know, I've seen, and I'm sure you have as well, have seen a significant number of resources pop up for students who are now learning online. You know, we've seen a lot of the continue learning, you know, gosh, there's so many cute terms around this right now. I think if your institution isn't supplying a microsite specifically dedicated to students transitioning into an online environment, I think maybe OLC, and I'm happy to do it as well, can provide you a few exemplars from some institutions that have done this really well, so that you can share that with your students too. And one thing I will say too, Christine, if you are just transitioning right now, face-to-face students into an online class, and you have the opportunity to kind of inventory their technology and their worries in one more face-to-face session and kind of test things out with them, that's a really big step forward in helping, you know, ease their transition as well. Does anyone have any resources to give to students? Yep. So Erin, I do think there are actually some really good microsites popping up. And so just like the last question, maybe we can, or maybe I can just add those to my slide deck, you know, when that's posted, so you can click through into a couple of peer institutions and see if that will be helpful. We also found there is an instructional design organization called Full Tilt. gosh, I hope I'm not messing it up and they're on the call, but they put together a really cool articulate story for students that are preparing to be an online student. We actually, it's open source and we used it in our continue teaching site. So at the very least, let me put that in my slide deck, or maybe next to the webinar recording for you all. Any thoughts you could share on your experience on assignments and how to conduct a fair exam and prevent cheating? Yes, yes. So this is an interesting time, I think, for test proctoring in the online environment. And I find that this question is often also related to the institutional culture where you're teaching as well, in terms of, how, one, are you an institution that has a lot of summative closed book assessments, but then two, are they proctored, and sort of what does that look like? I can tell you at NLU, we have historically not been the traditional final exam kind of institution, but we do have several courses and programs that lead to licensure, where some very specific exams need to be administered and proctored. And one of them had to happen last night in an online environment. And what they did was they utilized the breakout rooms in Zoom and put each individual student in their own breakout room. And then the faculty, there's actually two faculty teaching that, they just rotated through each of the breakout rooms to kind of monitor what was going on with the students. So a bit of a DIY, method for test proctoring, but it did work pretty well. What are the roles of school counselors who have to maintain boundaries and confidentiality? Also, how can we implement remote services for, I said, yeah, so interesting. I'm probably not the perfect person to answer this, Laura, but I will take a bit of a stab at it and say that, from a confidentiality perspective, I think this shows up more in some of our helping professions. We have a counseling and a PsyD program at NLU, and certainly there are things that get talked about in face-to-face courses that, are highly confidential in nature. And what I find myself asking is where is the differentiator between that happening face-to-face and happening in an online environment? And so I'm hard pressed to find the exact differentiator, but I do know that some of our faculty do feel strongly about that. And one way that you could sort of guarantee that, guarantee is a really hard word, but sort of promote this idea is to have passwords associated with the Zoom session for those kinds of conversations, and certainly turning off record and things like that as well. So for a class discussion, do you allow them to have all their microphones on at once, or do you control? Yeah. So what I would recommend is that you kind of start off after everyone is sort of oriented and everyone's had a chance to chat for a couple of seconds. I would recommend muting for just a little bit, so you can get through at least your micro lecture, if that's what you have planned. I think, or rely on your students to say, hey, when you're not talking, if you would mute, that would be great, right? So that's probably what I would recommend. Can you share or point us to some research about synchronous as effective? Yeah, so, so you're in the right place. The Online Learning Consortium has a peer-reviewed journal that sort of the no significant difference will pop up in that research. We, tend to talk about sort of efficacy, I think, in online ed in a couple of different ways. One is from a learning perspective, but then also maybe from a persistence perspective. And maybe satisfaction of the students as well. So I will say that, synchronous courses, when we append synchronous sessions to asynchronous courses, we will often actually find that performance and satisfaction are a little bit higher in those courses with those students. And so again, if I were to sort of pull an analogous situation around kind of the richness of this medium, If you are really spending time, utilizing active learning, techniques and really carefully planning your synchronous session, it is just as rich a medium as face-to-face. It's really about, the faculty member that is controlling that Zoom session, in my humble opinion. So our instructors aren't used to giving students opportunities for a lot of feedback on a weekly basis. How to encourage? Yeah, that's a really good question. And so, so this is an interesting point of conversation in online ed is grading feedback instruction? And the short answer is it depends. And there are many institutions that have, credit hour compliance policies that say yes or no. But I would say that, really substantive individualized grading feedback is instruction. And so maybe there's a way for you to sort of characterize how long they're on a Zoom session, for example. Maybe some of that is offset by the additional and, really helpful and insightful grading feedback that they are giving as well. So what are my thoughts about Zoom versus WebEx? I'm not paid by the Zoom organization to say this, but I will say what I know about Zoom is that it is designed for low bandwidth. And so I do not understand that is the case for WebEx. I am a surefire Zoom user over the last several years, and I find that it is also really easy to use. But again, I think WebEx has all the same functionality. So. Suggestions for an app or tool for introduction so everyone can see and get to know each other. For introductions, if you're talking asynchronously, I would just simply put together an introduction discussion forum. I think that is really the easiest way to do it. If you feel comfortable, encourage the students to do videos. That's a great way for students to kind of see each student and kind of hear from them as well. And boy, I really encourage you to do a video introduction too. So let's see, Liz, if you're scheduled to be in class for 3 hours, how much time is recommended? Yes, okay. Well, Liz, boy, are we having this conversation at each institution. So here is my humble opinion. And again, I think I'm trying to temper some of my responses today with the fact that, each institution may make different decisions about some of these items, but I would argue that a Zoom session over 2 hours leads itself to fatigue. Not only on the part of your learners, but probably also on the part of you. And I would be sort of concerned about how much passive listening, happens after that sort of hour and a half-ish mark. So I would recommend, slightly shorter Zoom sessions, maybe with an asynchronous piece that makes up for the additional seat time in the learning management system. So I do think students' lives won't look anything, yes, especially given every course will be online. On-campus students have been used to a schedule. How do we help them? Yes. How do I help myself? Yes. Gosh, I wish I remember exactly where I picked up this framework. But there is kind of a cadence to an online course rallied around 3, 5, 7, day 3, day 5, and day 7. And so one of the things that we do in our online student orientation at NLU is we provide that framework to our students. And we say on day 1, this is what you should be doing. You should be swinging through that module, making notes of what you have to read or watch, and what are the assessments and when are they due, right? And then we would argue that on day 2 is when they get all of their reading and watching, so all their course materials, are thoroughly, attended to on Tuesdays. On Wednesdays, they're posting probably their original discussion if they have discussion forum. And then on Thursday, they're planning their Sunday deadline, Sunday assessments. So I think if you can set that up as, sort of a Monday through Sunday kind of framework that aligns to the way that you set up your due dates, would really recommend that your due dates are consistent week to week, I think it will be really easy for them to kind of follow along and maybe for you to plan your grading time as well. So in my class, 1/3 of students are just not responding to my emails or remind text message. We're trying to transition to an online delivery. They are not logging into Canvas. I find myself obsessing about these students. Gosh, yes. Well, that's tough. You know, if they're completely not responsive at this point, that is a little concerning. It may be wise for you to locate their phone numbers and call them. You know, the thing that I'm sort of sensitive to these days is something might be wrong. And so I would recommend, you know, trying to get to them in a different medium like phone. And so I did notice that we're coming up on time here now, so I don't want to push us over time. Caitlin, suggestions on how to clear up the rest of the Q&A from this point?
Yes, thank you so much, Betty Jo. You answered those like rapid fire. I see we still have a few open, which I can send to you after the webinar. Maybe you have some suggestions for, but I know we've been sharing a lot of links in the chat to the OLC preparedness page. So that's also where we'll be posting a link to this recording and your slides so people can check there for more information. So at this time, I do see we are at time. So I just want to thank you once more, Betty Jo. Thank you for this fantastic webinar. Thank you to everyone that's attended today and submitted great questions. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording and you will receive a follow-up link to the resources, and have a great rest of your day. Also, there was another link. We have another webinar coming up next week. So stay tuned to the OLC page. That's where we'll be constantly posting resources and webinars for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend. Take care. Stay well.
Thank you, Betty Jo.
Bye, Paloma.